Since its establishment over 130 years ago, the general store has been the beating heart of Flinders. Having sold anything from groceries, fine china and hardware to coffee and sweets, the store is rich with history. Established in the late 1890s by Thomas Bullock, the general store has passed through many notable hands, down to the famous Frank and Olive Commons in the 1950s. During their time as owners, locals called the store the House of Commons. Frank and Olive's devotion to the local community became the stuff of legend and inspires Flinders locals to preserve their spirit of kindness and generosity.
My mother bowled with Olive, and she was a great bowler in her, I suppose you'd say, retirement. And when my mother died, Olive rang me up and said, the bowling ladies are going to do
the wake.
The wake. Do you want men's food or ladies' food? And I had to say, well, look, Olive, I really didn't know the difference. And she explained that men's food was fruitcake and pies and paddy pies and women's food was sponges and sandwiches. And I said, look, we'll probably need a bit of both because both men and women are coming. And that morning of the wake, down the hill, and at that stage there were 27 stairs to get in, and the house was much smaller than this. Down the hill came this army of women. They carried urns, they carried cutlery and boxes. It was like a tsunami, really. They all just came in, took over the house, produced the food, and I just stood round. I mean, and that was kind of what she did. She was very much I suppose you call the matriarch of the village.
He was such a lovely, gentle man, and Frank always moved at his own pace. He couldn't be hurried. He had his own way of sorting everything. There would be endless chatting, which some people found extremely frustrating, but you would have to wait till Frank sorted things the way Frank sorted things. So if I wanted 6 4-inch nails, I'd go with Frank to the counter. He'd go out the back, I'd come out the back with him. He'd find the sack of 4-inch nails and very methodically would select 4 of them. They'd be taken out of the sack. They'd then be taken over to the scales and weighed, and then Frank would go over and find the ledger of how much per pound of nails 4-inch nails would weigh, and then he'd methodically work out the cost of 6 4-inch nails, and then he'd put them very carefully in a paper bag for me, taped up, back to the counter, handed over. All of this could take about 10 to 15 minutes while the queue lengthened, and that was how Frank did business.
Frank used to say, if ever you went in and wanted to buy something, he'd say, what do you want it for? And you'd tell him, and he'd say, you don't want that, you want this. And then he'd disappear out the back and find something mysterious.
Frank was he never seemed to walk anywhere, he seemed to run everywhere. He was just such an active person. In fact, he made you tired just looking at him, to be honest. When I was working in the shop, he'd sort of run down to the back shed and run back to the shop, and you always felt you were a bit slow in your movements because he was so fast doing everything that he did. When I was expecting my son, Olive and Frank took my husband and myself to see My Fair Lady in Melbourne, the show, and I was probably just 2 months prior to having Bill. Must have been, he was born in September, so it was probably the end of July, and we went to Melbourne to see the show, and that was really special. It was a really special night. We had dinner out and then went to My Fair Lady, and they were just very kind people, really, really kind people. They were very involved people. They didn't sit on the fringe and supply a cake. They actually helped to serve it. They were hands-on in the community.
Frank's contribution to the Flinders community was recognised with a British Empire Medal. His son Bruce remembers his father's humility when receiving this honour.
He wasn't going to accept it. He didn't want to accept it, and There was a local now he only passed away just recently. It was John Winicky, who was QC, came into the shop and he found out that Dad wasn't going to accept the medal, and he said, walked up to my father and he said, "Frank, I want you out here into the storeroom," and I wasn't far away, and he said, "If you don't accept that medal," he said, "I've seen plenty that have got medals that didn't deserve them," and he said, "I know you deserve it." He said, "If you don't accept it, I'll never step into this shop again." And I think it hit home to my dad, so he eventually said he'd accept it, so yeah.
Frank and Olive's focus on helping the Flinders community remains strong to this day. The general store is still the centre of this small town, its presence a reminder of what makes Flinders special.
But it's interesting that what was set up by Frank, or not set up, but what existed in Frank and Olive's days, in the early days, still carries on, but in a different fashion now. And it's a bigger community, and everything's more complex, and people's expectations of what they have are much greater than they were in those days. But there's still that sense in Flinders of working together and identification with Flinders as a community, which is still quite strong.
I call it our Commonwealth, and I do think at times we are in danger of losing some of that important stuff, which is people willing to pull together and help each other. I think that it was very good in lockdown down here, by and large. People did pull together, and they did support each other, and the community grew a lot because a lot of the people who might holiday here chose that this was a much nicer place to be. And so there was a lot of, and a lot of people really went out of their way to support the local businesses. And I think in some ways that was quite healthy for the community.
I mean, back in the 1560s, it's still such a small community in many ways. So the holiday makers did get to know the locals, and the locals get to know the holiday makers. And now it's still a very complex and supportive community, as we talked about before, with the number of businesses and enterprises in the town that do support the community in so many different ways. And you've got the Lions, and you've got the church, and so many people working to do good things in the community. But you're very lucky in Flinders in who you get, like to have people like Frank and Olive running that store for so long, and to have two very kind, thoughtful, intelligent people who had the best interests of the community always at heart. And I think, you know, it set a very good example for the rest of for the community about those things.
As Flinders grows and changes, we can look to the example set by Frank and Olive and remember that simple kindness and generosity is what keeps this community alive.
I've been coming to Flinders my whole life, and back in the day we'd play in the playground next to the general store. It isn't there anymore. The roundabout was my favourite, and my sister Olivia and I would push each other round and round and round. One day, however, there was a little accident. We headed back to the store, and was surprised when passing Frank, he scooped me up, flung me over his shoulders like a bag of spuds, and I could then see a trail of blood behind me. I was rushed inside where Olive was consulted, and I was considered a Hastings Hospital emergency. You can imagine how much that thrilled my mother. So we set off for the hospital, where I returned with 36 stitches in my heel. And I guess it's thanks to Frank that I narrowly avoided a prosthetic heel. It was the mid-70s, I was about 5, and I still have the scar to prove it.